Imagine a world where the scent of burning flesh doesn't horrify, it fascinates. A world where justice isn't whispered in quiet courtrooms, but screamed through agony in open squares. In 1531, in the bustling heart of Tudor London, such a world wasn't fiction, it was law. And on a grim March morning, beneath gray, choking skies, the air in Smithfield Market turned rancid with the smell of boiling meat, not from a butcher's cart, but from the body of a man. His name was Richard Rouse, a cook, a man who fed nobles, a man who, according to the Crown, had committed a crime so vile it could only be purged with fire, steam, and screams. His sentence? Death by boiling. Not hanging, not the axe. Boiling. Alive. In oil. In public. Ordered not by some blood-soaked warlord in a distant land, but by King Henry VIII of England, a monarch once called the defender of the faith, now increasingly worshipped only in fear. But what crime could justify such cruelty? What did this man do to deserve a death so torturous it was abolished shortly after, never again inflicted in England? To answer that, we must descend, not into hell, but into the mindset of a kingdom on the brink, England, where the rules of religion were crumbling, where the very soul of the nation was being reshaped by one man's obsession for power, legacy, and a male heir. In this world, a meal could become a murder weapon. A kitchen could be a battlefield. Richard Rouse was accused not of treason or war, but of poisoning porridge. The pot in question had been a prominent religious figure who had publicly opposed Henry's plans to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine. The bishop never ate it, but others did. 2 died, others fell ill, and suddenly, Rouse, a servant, a cook, wasn't just an accused poisoner. He became a symbol, a warning. Historians still debate the details. Was Rouse truly guilty, or merely a scapegoat? What we do know is that his fate had already been sealed long before the first bubbles rose in the pot that killed him. You see, Henry needed more than justice. He needed spectacle. He needed fear, and above all he needed obedience in a world slipping from his grip. The act of poisoning, especially within a noble household, was seen as treasonous, even demonic. As Purcheton was ready to destroy Henry's life, Purcheton seemed to try to destroy him demonic. Food was sacred, intimate, shared among family, clergy, and royalty. To violate that trust was to violate the very order of things. So the king did not seek to understand. He sought to terrorize. He passed a new law just for Rouse, that those who committed murder by poison would be boiled alive. No trial by jury, no second chances, just oil, fire, flesh. Eyewitness accounts paint a scene so horrific it scorched itself into the memory of a nation. Rouse, bound in chains, was lowered slowly into a vast cauldron of boiling liquid in Smithfield. His screams, they say, echoed across London. Not instantly dead. No, that would be mercy. The heat peeled his skin, melted his fat, burst his eyes. Onlookers vomited. Some fainted. Others watched, transfixed. A dark communion between power and pain. It was meant to show the people what happens when one threatens the crown's peace. It did more than that. It revealed how fragile that peace truly was, because beneath the horror something deeper was boiling. Unrest, paranoia, and the bloody birth of a new kind of tyranny. Henry's break from Rome, his hunger for control over the church, his rewriting of divine law, all of it demanded obedience. And that obedience would be extracted not through reason, but through ritual sacrifice. The execution of Richard Rouse was no longer about justice. It became theater, a ritual cleansing of dissent, a message to every servant, every cook, every commoner. Even the lowliest among you can be tortured beyond death if the king wills it. especially if the king wills it. But Henry's message had unintended consequences. The sheer barbarity of Rouse's death shocked even his loyal subjects. Parliament grew uneasy. Public executions had always been brutal, but this was different. It felt ancient, pagan. A sacrifice, not a sentence. And in the silence that followed, a strange thing happened. People began to question, not openly, God, no, but in whispers, in shadows, in chapels and kitchens and taverns. Murmurs grew. If a king could rewrite the law for one man, who would be next? Years later, boiling as punishment was quietly removed from English law. Officially, it was deemed too cruel. But the truth is, it had worked too well. It exposed the very thing it was meant to suppress. Fear. Not of poison, but of power. And while Richard Rouse's bones were long turned to ash, his death lingered in England's memory like a sickness that wouldn't heal. He became a ghost in the history books, a grim reminder that justice, in the wrong hands, is nothing but a mask for vengeance. And yet, beneath the horror, something else lurks, something more haunting than pain, the possibility that Rouse was innocent, that he was a pawn in a game far larger than he could ever comprehend. The bishop he allegedly targeted had enemies at the highest levels. Swan said, "The porridge could have been tampered with by anyone, but someone had to bleed, someone had to boil. And Rouse, well, he was convenient, forgotten by history, remembered only through the way he died, not the life he lived. This is the curse of forgotten men in dark times. Their stories vanish, their screams echo only in the pages of dusty tomes. But if you listen closely, if you lean into the silence between the facts, history begins to speak, and what it says is this: cruelty wears many crowns, it speaks in many tongues, and sometimes the loudest warnings are whispered through the broken bodies of the powerless. Richard Rouse's boiling wasn't justice, it was prophecy, a sign of the unraveling that was yet to come, because just as the pot in Smithfield cooled and hardened into still silence, Henry's England would soon erupt again. The flames had barely cooled beneath Richard Rouse's cauldron when something darker began to take shape in the shadow of Henry VIII's court. Something colder than oil, more silent than screams. England was not simply a kingdom now, it was a crucible, slowly refining loyalty from fear and truth from silence. And as the monarchy fed on obedience, new terrors were being born in silence. You see, the execution of Rouse wasn't just an isolated horror. It was a blueprint, a whisper to every ear in the realm. The king's word is not law, it is fate. And once that fate is declared, it is irreversible. What followed wasn't the collapse of cruelty, it was its evolution. The Tudor world, already blood-soaked from centuries of feudal violence and whispered heresies, was entering a new phase, a darker one, where pain wasn't just punishment, it was performance, and the audience was everyone. Across the smoke-choked cities and damp countryside, the people watched their world shift beneath them. The church, once the spine of daily life, now cracked into fragments under Henry's will. The monasteries, with their libraries and secrets and centuries of stored knowledge, were dismantled brick by brick. Their relics were destroyed, their priests were hunted, and in their place rose a new kind of holy man, one who bowed not to Rome, but to the crown. It wasn't just a change in ritual, it was a theft of identity. Imagine watching your entire belief system, the only certainty in a violent, unpredictable life, rewritten by decree, the stained glass shattered, the crucifixes torn down, the bones of saints discarded like refuse. That's what it meant to live in Henry's England, not just to obey, but to forget what came before. But in every forced silence a new scream waits to be born, and among the poorest in the realm, where ignorance was survival and superstition replaced scripture, those screams took shape as something older than the church: witchcraft. It was during this unraveling that the fear of witches, once a fringe concern, began its slow and brutal rise. Now, the flames that once danced beneath traders began licking at the feet of midwives, healers, widows, women whose only crime was knowledge, independence, or simply being alone. These women knew herbs, they knew illness, they knew the way a body breaks, and in a world where control was everything, such knowledge became dangerous. It began quietly. A child died after drinking a tonic. A lord's son fell ill. A crop failed under an unnatural moon. And somewhere nearby, always nearby, was a woman. Perhaps she had no husband. Perhaps she spoke to animals. Perhaps she simply lived on the edge of the village and looked strange when she smiled, and so she was dragged through the mud, through prayer, through flame. The same society that boiled a cook alive now began tying stones to the ankles of women and tossing them into rivers to see if God would intervene. Float, and you were a witch. Sink, and you were innocent, but dead. The perfect system. No room for error, no room for doubt. And what made it worse, what made it truly terrifying, was that these rituals weren't performed by wild mobs or sadistic outcasts. They were sanctioned, legal, often conducted by men in robes who believed they were saving the victim's soul, even as they snapped her bones. The state and the church had become two arms of the same beast, and beneath their grasp old knowledge withered. Ancient herbal remedies were now devil's medicine. Midwifery became witchcraft, and anyone who remembered the old ways was burned for clinging to them. Set this concluding sum. But why now? Why this sudden obsession with rooting out hidden evil? Because hidden evil justified total control. If the devil could be hiding in your neighbor, your wife, your physician, then only the king, God's chosen on earth, could protect you. It was the oldest trick in history. Invent an invisible enemy, then offer yourself as the only defense. And the people, they believed. They had to question the trials, the executions, the disappearances. That was to question the divine order. And questioning that meant joining the witches, the heretics, the traitors. And so the prisons filled, not just with criminals, but with thinkers, with men who translated forbidden texts, with women who taught their daughters how to ease childbirth without a priest's blessing, with children who spoke too freely or not enough. Torture became routine. The rack, the thumbscrew, the scavenger's daughter, an iron vice that crushed the spine inward until blood poured from every orifice. This wasn't about truth. It was about confession. Because a tortured body doesn't lie, it simply obeys, and in that obedience, power fed itself. But even within this darkness, strange ironies emerged. While witches were burned in one village, in another the royal court indulged in rituals far older and far more pagan than the common folk could imagine. Alchemists were summoned to turn lead to gold. Astrologers mapped the stars to predict war and childbirth. The very same nobles who ordered the execution of women for knowing too much paid fortunes to foreign mystics who promised power through forbidden symbols. Behind velvet curtains, the crown's most trusted whispered spells, drew circles in blood, consulted the dead, and always, they called it science. This hypocrisy was not lost on the people, but what could they do? Speak and die, protest and vanish. All they could do was pass their stories in secret, around hearths, in lullabies, in coded songs. That's how truth survived, not in books or sermons, but in myth, in cautionary tales, And in those tales, history itself became a ghost, unseen, but always watching, always whispering, because somewhere in the soot-covered bones of a burned witch, in the shattered glass of a ruined chapel, in the final gasping prayer of a man stretched beyond breaking, lies the question we still can't answer. How does a society convince itself that horror is justice, that pain is purification, that the scream of the innocent is somehow holy? Perhaps because the truth is too terrifying, that behind every monstrous ritual is not evil, but fear. Fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear that the old gods are real and that they are angry. And in Henry's England, fear was law. The ash from 100 burnings still lingered in the corners of England's soul, carried in the folds of cloaks and the silence of those who survived. But as the fires of witchcraft flickered across the countryside, a new kind of terror emerged, not born in shadow, but in sunlight, in the cold, pristine halls of medicine. For while the king's justice mutilated the body, the doctor's cure often did far worse. This was a time when illness was punishment and healing was often indistinguishable from torture, where to fall sick was to gamble with your life, not only against disease, but against the men tasked with saving you. And the deeper you dig into the medical practices of the medieval and early modern world, the more one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. Sometimes the cure was worse than the curse. Imagine being racked by fever in the year 1540. Your skin burns, your bones ache, your breath is shallow. The doctor arrives, not with medicine, but with razors and leeches. He studies your face, not your symptoms, and declares your humors imbalanced, too much black bile, or perhaps a corruption of the phlegm. Then he cuts you open, not to remove anything, but to bleed you, because in this world, the body was a battlefield between 4 invisible forces, and imbalance meant death. And so they bled the young, the old, the pregnant, sometimes until they passed out, sometimes until they died. And if they lived, it was the bleeding that saved them. If they died, God's will. This wasn't ignorance, it was doctrine, rooted in ancient Greek theories passed down for centuries, unchanged, unchallenged, and enforced like scripture. Even as plagues decimated populations, doctors clung to their rituals like priests at the altar. They used mercury to treat syphilis. Mercury, the liquid metal that corrodes organs and poisons the blood. They drilled into skulls to release demons. They forced patients to vomit until their insides tore. And always, they believed, because belief, in that time, was more powerful than evidence. Observation was heresy, and those who dared suggest that illness might have natural causes, filth, rats, infected water, were often silenced before their ideas could spread. But behind the closed doors of apothecaries and plague houses, strange figures were beginning to rise. Men who wore bird-like masks filled with herbs and oils, not as superstition, but as primitive filters designed to block the stench of decay they believed caused disease. They moved among the dying during outbreaks of the Black Death, cloaked like priests of pestilence. They were feared, sometimes even attacked, because to the common people, these masked men were not saviors, they were omens. Their presence meant death was near. And death came often. It came through the water, through the rats, through the trade ships that kissed the docks of London with infected breath. Entire families vanished overnight. Streets lined with carts bearing corpses, piled like discarded cattle. Children beeping beside rotting parents. And above it all, the church bells. Ceaseless, haunting, tolling the names of the dead until there were none left to ring them. The doctors, helpless, the priests, overwhelmed, the shadows of ruined monasteries, and behind the heavy doors of plague hospitals, something older than medicine, older than kings, stirred in the bones of civilization, a question that refused to die. What lies beneath the rituals, the dogma, the blood, as the fires of execution and the steel of misguided surgery carved their marks across Europe? Exercising prison labor became practice. Whispers began to drift from the deserts, the jungles, the mountains, echoes of forgotten cities swallowed by time, of temples older than scripture, of civilizations whose names were not spoken in Latin or Greek, but in the languages, and it is here that our journey leads us now, not into the cruelty of justice or the horrors of healing, but into the ruins of worlds that once were, and may still be. Imagine stepping through a jungle so thick the light never fully reaches the forest floor. Vines choke the earth, the air is wet, breathing with unseen creatures. And then, suddenly, rising from the green like the bones of a buried god, a pyramid. Not just stone piled high, but a mathematical marvel, aligned to the solstice, etched with glyphs that speak of time as a living force. This is not fantasy. This is Tikal, Copan, Palenque, civilizations we once called lost, though they were never truly missing. We just stopped listening. The Mayans did not simply build. They encoded. Their architecture was scripture. Their cities, celestial instruments, and their rituals were bloody. But they were not savage. They were sacred. Every offering, every cut, every beating heart held aloft was not an act of violence. It was a dialogue with the divine. To them, blood was not a punishment. It was a gift, a key, a currency. Now their gods did not dwell in heaven. They walked among them in cycles, in seasons, in storms, and to maintain the balance between man and the cosmos, blood had to flow like rain, not just from enemies, sometimes from kings, sometimes from queens, sometimes from children. To modernize, it is monstrous. But what if it's us who are blind? The Mayans knew the turning of the stars with a precision modern astronomers still admire. They charted eclipses centuries in advance. They mapped Venus like a sacred obsession, and yet they left their cities, abandoned them. Not to war, not to disease, but as part of a pattern we still don't understand. And what does it say about us, that we study their ruins not with reverence, but with suspicion? That we call them lost simply because they are no longer ours? And they are not alone. Half a world away, beneath the dusty sands of the Middle East, lie the shattered skeletons of a city so old it predates writing itself. Göbekli Tepe. Thousands of years before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before the Bible, beneath the ashes of empires and the bones of vanished gods, lies a truth too ancient, too unsettling to fit inside textbooks or timelines. It pulses in the quiet spaces between what is remembered and what is denied. And as we close this journey through the underbelly of history, past the screams of the executed, the moans of the cured, the forgotten wisdom of vanished worlds, one final horror waits in the dark, a horror not of steel or fire or poison, but of culture, of belief, of the twisted rituals we once called customs, unchallenged, unquestioned, performed with pride. And perhaps nowhere is this darkness more intimate, more disturbing, than in the strange and brutal practices of medieval daily life. The small horrors, the normalized pain, the quiet suffering that wore the mask of tradition. Picture a castle. Not the fancy clean stone, roaring hearths, polished armor, but the real thing, damp, freezing, reeking of rot and excrement. In the most opulent courts of Europe, people lived with filth so constant it became invisible. Toilets, buckets dumped from windows. Hygiene, a sin of vanity. Baths were rare, discouraged even, believed to open the body to illness. And so the air reeked, of sweat, of unwashed flesh, of rotting teeth and infected wounds. Even royalty stank. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly owned over 1,000 gowns, but bathed perhaps once a month. Beneath her powdered face, her teeth blackened, her breath foul, but no one dared say a word. Cleanliness was suspicious. Dirt meant humility. Disease was divine punishment. And when illness came, as it always did, it wasn't hidden, it was displayed. Children covered in pox, adults with faces eaten away by leprosy, open sores, gangrenous limbs, plague buboes like grapes swelling beneath the skin, and yet people smiled, feasted, prayed as the infected walked among them. This was normal. Suffering was expected. Death was not an interruption, it was woven into life, like thread into cloth. And while we marvel at the grandeur of their cathedrals, we forget what happened inside them, not just worship, but fear, control. Bodies denied pleasure, minds denied freedom. Children whipped for sin before they understood what sin was. Women silenced, their bodies not their own, their fates traded like currency. Marriages arranged by age 10. Virginity measured not in dignity, but in dowries. Girls made mothers before their voices changed. And when childbirth came, it came without mercy. No anesthesia, no sterilization, no guarantee of survival. For many, the birthing bed was a coffin in disguise, and when they died, there were no monuments, just another name in the parish ledger. The same society that burned women as witches idolized men who starved themselves to death for holiness, saints whose decaying bodies were paraded through towns, whose bloody garments were kissed by the desperate, who mutilated their flesh to resist temptation, and were celebrated for it. In a world where pain was virtue, pleasure was heresy, and the body a prison, a battleground between angels and demons, every breath a test, every desire a danger. But the most disturbing rituals were not those cloaked in faith, but in justice. Trial by ordeal was common. To prove your innocence, you might be ordered to plunge your arm into boiling water, retrieve a stone and wait to see if your wounds festered, or to walk barefoot across red-hot plowshares, or be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, the devil was with you. If you drowned, your soul was pure. Either way, you lost. And the crowd watched, nodded, approved. This was not barbarism. This was law. Children were not spared. They worked by 7, flogged for disobedience, starved for minor sins, apprenticed to men who treated them as slaves, and if they survived, they were lucky. Most didn't. Famine was frequent, war was constant, and across Europe, people lived and died without ever leaving their village, their world miles wide, their future pre-written. And through it all, there was ceremony, endless, rigid, sacred ceremony, the feasts, the fasts, the processions through mud and fire, people dancing in masks to ward off plague, self-flagellating monks moaning through the streets, weddings where the bride was examined for blood on the sheets the next morning, funerals where the poor sold their own coffins to buy bread, every moment ritualized, every stage of life governed by expectation, no choice, no deviation, just roles, imposed like chains. Even sleep wasn't an escape.